Still on real estate, as real estate prices bloom across the globe, house hunters in Amsterdam say they're losing out on deals even when bidding 30% or more above asking price in a city that's deemed to be one of the riskiest housing markets in the world. Prices surged 16.5% in July through September period this year from the same period in 2020, according to NVM, a Dutch association of real estate agents and appraisers, with the average price of a transaction at roughly 564,000 euros, about $636,600. Seyi Omidiora, who is an analyst with Financial Derivatives Company Limited, joins us now to discuss more on real estate and other matters. Seyi, good morning. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good morning. Thank you for having
Start
me.
with the Netherlands. Great to have you. What's the push with what we're seeing in the Netherlands with that jump?
Okay, yes. So what we observed basically during the course of the year generally has been global inflation, which has driven up the prices of commodities generally. And this was mostly driven by China, who are the major importers of a lot of these construction materials, things like steel, things like granite, and other things. So, of course, that consequently pushed up the prices of commodities and subsequently also pushed up the prices of houses because, of course, without these commodities, of course, then you're not going to have houses. Also, lumber has seen a spike from basically from a July low and has gone up substantially since that time. So, of course, all of these things coming together has basically increased the prices of houses. And of course, the trend is expected to continue because things like policies from the government, things like the disbursements to people. So, of course, all of these things are also pushing up inflation, and subsequently, this has also reflected in the housing market as well.
Great stuff. Let's come to Nigeria. Real estate recovery, I think, 4% GDP growth Q3. That's overall GDP. Housing, I think real estate was at 10% or so, which is decent. But I want to counterbalance that with rising cement prices. I think it's 60 or 70% year on year in Nigeria. How do you counterbalance that between real estate GDP growth and cement? What's the impact of those rising prices on the growth of the sector?
Okay, yes. I mean, what we think the implications of that will be for the sector primarily is that in the short term, we might end up seeing, say, delays in construction because, I mean, if you look at the budget these people have for their construction plans, they already have budgets in place. And, of course, a spike in cement prices probably will put a dampener and, of course, will slow down construction. You might even see, ultimately, some projects being halted altogether, and this of course isn't something people want to see at all. And in the long term, basically it might end up pushing development, and we might end up seeing, say, new products, or rather new construction materials, say development in R&D, things like that, where we can use alternate materials in building instead of having to depend on things like cement alone. So that's probably going to be long-term implications of things like that.
Great stuff. You just saw Governor Sanwo-Olu talking about planting trees in Lagos, and the reducing our carbon footprint, right? Now, I do want to ask you about the federal government completing, I think, about 2,000 or so affordable housing units over the last 5 years, which is commendable. I think they're going to start selling them about 7.23 million. It's affordable. However, talk to us about the trade-off between more housing developments and deforestation. Putting into context, of course, the Lagos State governor talking about planting more trees. How do you put all that together?
Okay, yes. So this phenomenon actually in economics is something called Cosnets Curve, where with new developments, especially in poorer countries, then we are going to see a lot of degradation, environmental degradation. But in much more developed countries, then we are likely, that trend basically just reverts itself, and of course that doesn't happen. And this is something, and we know the poverty levels in Nigeria, so it's likely that the first part of that Cosnets Curve theory is going to apply to us. And of course, the implications of that, or the way to balance it basically, is we know there are forest conservation methods. So the best thing to do basically is to wait for felled trees, or basically wait for felled trees to mature first, and then before cutting them down. And of course, also maybe even trying to explore other building materials, basically, so we don't end up having to cut down trees in the first place.
All right, great stuff. Still on cement, I think Africa's output for emissions as far as cement is what? 440 megatons of carbon dioxide, right? A third of which comes from cement manufacturing. How do we, or rather, not how, is Nigeria, I don't think there's been any language from the government with respect to trying to reduce those emissions. So can we incur penalties? That's one. And what can the country explore in terms of reducing emissions from the manufacturing sector for cement and these other areas?
Okay, yes. So in terms of whether incurring penalties, in the short term, maybe not, because of course we all know this, even in developed countries, this is an ongoing trend with, in terms of having to migrate or transition from GHG emissions into cleaner energy, into cleaner, using cleaner fuels, basically, in order to drive industrialization. So in terms of that, in the short term, probably not. However, in terms of obtaining financing for new projects, it might be difficult, because what financiers will look out for is whether or not your investments are compliant with the new GHG net zero emissions being basically around the globe that countries are trying to transition to. So it's if it's not compliant, then of course you might not get financing for new projects, which definitely will have an impact on development. And this is not, it definitely is not something we want to see in Nigeria. In terms of things we can explore, well, we can look at unlocking green financing. And of course, one way to do that is basically to make sure that your projects are compliant, as I said earlier. And this, of course, gives investors comfort that, okay, their investments are basically generating the carbon savings that the company or the country is saying it's going to generate. Then another thing also is about basically upskilling the current workforce, because we know that with the development in real estate and with development in countries, basically, we know for sure that it's going to be driven basically by GHG emissions, and consequently, a lot of private companies will have to be the ones to drive that development, and they will basically be the ones to also lead in terms of upskilling or reskilling the workforce. So there are basically two areas we think we can explore in Nigeria.
Excellent stuff. Seyi Omidiora, an analyst with Financial Derivatives Company Limited. Thank you so much for joining us.